All right, well, if you'll turn over on the back of the sheet, you'll see our outline for the night. That will serve you well. Just kidding. You have all kinds of room to take notes as you so desire. I apologize for not having an outline. Tonight was just, it wasn't the kind of talk that lent itself well to an outline. And so we will just kind of go with it. Of course, we are going through Eugene Peterson's book, Tell It Slant, which will continue to take us through the middle portion of Luke's Gospel. Last week, we were primarily in chapter 11. We take a little bit of a jump forward this week just to remind you of the specific content that we're looking at. There are 10 unique parables that are only found in Luke's Gospel that we have in this travel narrative between Luke 9 and Luke 19. When it says in Luke 9 that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem, and so he's leaving Galilee and headed up to Jerusalem, and then he arrives there in Jerusalem in Luke 19 for what we know of as Holy Week. But really everything in between is this travel narrative, and in those 10 chapters, Luke records for us 10 parables that are unique to his gospel. So each week we are looking primarily at one of those parables. And tonight the parable is the barn builder in Luke chapter 12. So I would invite you to open up to Luke 12 and follow along with me as I read. I want to just read through the parable to begin with, and then we'll make some observations after that and kind of teach back through it. But beginning in Luke chapter 12 and verse 13, it says, "Someone in the crowd said to him," being Jesus obviously, said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" Now, I have to be just completely honest with you. When I saw the subject of this week's parable, I got a little nervous. Because as you can see, it is the barn builder. Now, we're not building a barn out there, but we are building something out there, and we have built a barn in the past. We usually call that building down there the bus barn. And so I'll have to admit that in my reading and in my studying and in my contemplation, I'm like very vulnerable before the Lord, thinking, "Okay, Lord, is there something you need to teach us in the context of that?" And I ran across one statement in the context of this chapter that I can wholeheartedly agree with. Eugene Peterson says, "Building barns doesn't leave much energy left over for the time-consuming work of loving our neighbors, let alone our God." I'm sure that's the case for barns. I know it's the case for church buildings. I have often heard it said that pastors, it is not unusual for a pastor to leave a church when a construction project is over. Now, the good news is I have no intentions of leaving the church. No prospects on the horizon, not looking for prospects on the horizon. I don't think I will make it to the 40 years that Phil has given us, because I don't think you would want me when I'm that old as I would have to be to make it to 40 years. But I'm hoping to make it at least half that far. here at Utica, because this is a wonderful place. But I certainly understand now. This is the first building project I've ever been a part of, and so I understand it is an all-encompassing, all-consuming task sometimes. And so I definitely understand what Peterson is saying there. And of course, he's not talking about building a church building. He's talking about the fact that when you are consumed with the material things of your life, and you're always looking to acquire more and protect your investments and grow your investments and look at your portfolio and all those kinds of things, it really doesn't leave much energy for the time-consuming work of loving our neighbors, which is what much of the previous two parables have been about being a good neighbor and loving the Lord well. So we just need to take that into consideration. Now, the interesting thing about looking at these parables in series is being able to see patterns developing, to be able to see contrasts, and just to see what Jesus is purposing to do in one parable versus the next. And it's interesting if you look at the way these first three parables in this series have developed. They've all come at the request, basically. They've all been triggered by something said out in the crowd. So we've had questions, we've had requests. If you think back to our first week, there was a spiritual question that was asked of Jesus, and that is, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? So in the context of this blatantly spiritual question, Jesus provides what some would call a fairly secular answer. He tells a story about a guy who got beaten up on the road and people who took care of him. So he gets a spiritual question, and then he gives a fairly secular, at least on the surface, a secular answer or a secular story of the Good Samaritan. And then the story that we looked at last week, or the parable that we looked at last week, also came in the context of a spiritual request. So this time it wasn't a question that the disciples were asking, but they made a request of Jesus, teach us to pray. And if you weren't here with us last week, we were reminded of the fact that this is the only time in the Gospels where Jesus specifically is asked to teach his disciples. This is the only time in those four Gospels where they say specifically, teach us something, and they're asking to be taught to pray. And so once again, we have an overtly spiritual request, and Jesus, part of his answer is a fairly secular answer. Once again, he tells a story about a friend at midnight who comes and he needs bread for somebody that has arrived in the middle of the night from a journey, and so he needs bread. So one of the observations that Eugene Peterson makes, which I think helps to tie these conversations together, why doesn't Jesus answer these overtly spiritual, and even in the case of the first one, and probably the second one as well, when they say teach us to pray, these overtly theological questions, Jesus answers in a very everyday kind of way. And Peterson observes, maybe Jesus is trying to wean us from chattering God talk. We talked a little bit about this last week, but basically what he's trying to get us to recognize is that sometimes we are more comfortable talking about theological things that we learn at church, that we read about in the Scriptures. Sometimes we're more comfortable talking about those things than doing the hard work of ministry, which is the application of those things. You know, theology can be difficult to understand, but it's not necessarily uncomfortable to us. But sometimes when we roll our sleeves up, sometimes it's difficult to get into the everyday aspects of ministry. And so Jesus may be trying to encourage us not to distance ourselves from people by keeping the talk way up here in terms of theological things, but being willing to get into the details of people's lives, because that's certainly what he does in each of these episodes. And so that brings us to tonight, and the pattern is kind of backwards. So the previous two parables, we had a spiritual question, which Jesus answered with a fairly secular answer or story. Here it's backwards. It's the other way around. We have a fairly secular request. These people come to Jesus, and this unnamed person basically says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And the assumption there is he doesn't feel like he's getting a fair shake, and he wants Jesus to help him with that. Now let me just pause right there and say this is a very common problem. In my years of ministry, it's unfortunate how often something like this happens. You'll have a parent pass away, and now the siblings are left to deal with the estate stuff. And of course, usually if things are done well, you have an executor of a will, and that executor has a fair amount of power in the way things are done. But let me just stop and say, this isn't the point of this story, and it's not the point of tonight's message, but make sure that you're well prepared for that. Make sure that you're not putting all of the burden on whoever it is that will fall to. The more you can plan that out, write that out, and get that thing laid out, the better it's going to be for the people that you're leaving stuff to. But apparently this guy wasn't satisfied with the way he was being included in the inheritance, and he came to Jesus. And Jesus' answer is really surprising based on what we just studied last week. Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Now, of course, we know if you take 10 steps back and look in the grand scheme of things, we know the answer to that question is really, well, Jesus is the ultimate judge, and he is the arbitrator. He is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. But his specific point is not in this particular case. But it's odd that Jesus kind of sidesteps the question a little bit. Peterson says his refusal strikes us as odd because we know that rabbis were and still are judges in the Jewish community. And that's how he addressed Jesus. "Teacher, Rabbi, help me with the inheritance." But even more so, coming so soon after the prayer and the parable on prayer, Jesus' response is even more odd. Now, Peterson kind of broke down what we talked about a little bit last week. Remember, with both the Lord's Prayer, but then also the story of the friend at midnight, both of those stories, we talked about relationship. Both the prayer and the story started with a vocative address, addressing someone by a name or a title. So in the prayer, what was the name or the title that began the prayer in the Lord's Prayer? What was the name or the title at the beginning? Father. Okay, so the Lord's Prayer, as Jesus taught it, began with Father. The story of the friend at midnight, he comes knocking on his door, and he says to his neighbor, "Friend, I need some bread." So in both of those, it starts with this vocative address of one person talking to another person directly in relationship, and that's exactly what this guy did. He came up to Jesus, and he said, "Teacher," and he made his request. And so here is a man doing exactly what Jesus urged us to do, both in the Lord's Prayer and in the commentary that followed that. He asked, he was seeking, he was knocking, and yet Jesus seemed to sidestep the question a little bit. So we have this secular request dealing with the inheritance, and then we have what I would call, these are my words here, these are not Peterson's words. We have what I would call a secu-spiritual answer. So the part of the answer is secular, the story of the barn builder who has these crops, but then part of that is a spiritual thing because he works God into that, and he's talking about treasures and the kingdom and those kinds of things. But one of the things I thought about, and that Peterson kind of spells out a little bit in his book, we tend to think of our life in terms of categories. And if you think about our life being represented by whatever's inside the box here, okay, so if you put everything in your life into this box, we sometimes oversimplify things, and we divide this box into two different parts. And part of it is what we do here on Sundays and on Wednesdays, and what we do in our personal devotional times, or if we're out witnessing to somebody. So we might label the top of that box the sacred stuff. I've been using the term spiritual up to this point, but same basic idea, that if we're not careful, we might think of part of our life as being in that category of the sacred stuff, the holy stuff, the stuff that's set apart, and then what would be in the bottom half of the box, if that's how we're dividing things. Then you have the secular stuff below that. And if we're not careful, that's the way we think about our life. And we might think, okay, going to church, reading the Bible, praying, witnessing, all those things are kind of in the sacred box, and then all the other stuff is in the secular box. And if we're sloppy Bible students, you actually might have a proof text to support that kind of view. As I was drawing this, I thought about what Jesus said in Luke 20:25, where he's asked about paying taxes. And part of his response is, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So if you're a sloppy Bible student and you don't really dig into the context of what Jesus is talking about, you might think, well, even Jesus is saying the same thing. You got God's stuff up at the top, and you got Caesar's stuff at the bottom, or somewhere in there. And so you might look to a verse like this and find support for that false dichotomy of how we look at our life. But then, of course, we have to think about other scriptures that demonstrate that that is a sloppy way of looking at that verse. Verses like Romans 11:36 that says, from him and through him and to him are the things in the top half of the box, right? No, all things are from him and through him and to him. Everything around us, everything in our life, every circumstance that we find ourselves in, from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. And then another verse that I thought about is just a simple verse like what Paul used when he was sharing the gospel in Athens. And in Acts 17:28, he says, in him we live and move and have our being. So really, we tend to think about life in compartmentalized ways, when in reality, this is what our life looks like. Everything belongs to God. Everything is for God. 1 Corinthians 10:31 is a great way of summarizing that teaching. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Those two particular activities we don't often think about as being spiritual activities, but yet Paul reminds us that we're to do all of those things for the glory of God. I love this quote by Abraham Kuyper. I think I've shared this in the past, but I know it's been a while. But Kuyper, from a couple centuries ago, I believe, said, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence, of our human existence, over which Christ, who is sovereign, does not cry, mine. There is no aspect of our life that doesn't belong to him. And I think the way that Jesus tells these stories and the way that Jesus answers what seem to be sacred spiritual questions by telling what seem to be non-spiritual stories, but then in this particular event, there is a secular question, a secular request that Jesus brings God right into the picture of it. So this is a reminder to us that our life really looks like this, that all of our life is God's domain. And the reason that's important for us is it puts into perspective this idea of real relationship. That this is the big difference between a thought process that is more characteristic of religion. You know, if you're doing religion, you can do that on Sunday, and you can do that on Wednesday, and you can do that at certain points of your day. But if we recognize that following Christ is about relationship, and Jesus said, I am with you, when? Always. I'm with you always. You know, one of my most specific prayers for my kids this week. You know, my kids have been homeschooled for 4 years, and now they're gone back into the public school system. And there's lots of stuff specifically to be prayed for. You know, there are details that cover the gamut of the things they'll be hearing that they're not used to hearing, and the things they'll be doing that they're not used to doing. But my biggest prayer for them has been, Lord, just help them to know that you are with them, and that you're just as with them on the school campus as you are when we're here in this sanctuary. That there is not a dichotomy of, oh, he's really with us when we're here. You know, that we get into a false sense of division if we think about life that way. And I think that will also lead us to holier living if we recognize he's always with us. You know, there are things that we will not do in the presence of other people physically, but we got to remember Jesus is always with us. So we got to stop thinking about these categories of the sacred and the secular, and remember what Jesus has taught us. Okay, so back to the specific question. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, Peterson asks, was this man's request to Jesus in a matter of justice? So he has an issue in which he thinks he is not receiving justice. You know, Jesus, help me with this. I'm not getting my fair share. I'm not getting the piece of the pie that belongs to me. Was this man's request a smokescreen obscuring something quite different? Jesus thought it was, and his story blew the smoke away. And we know that from right off the bat. You know, sometimes Jesus, in our previous, the first parable especially, Jesus was asked this question, and when the lawyer got to the point that he asked, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus just went right into the story. But in this one, he gives a warning first. Before he launches into the story, he gives this warning. He says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. So Jesus, in a way, shows his hand from the beginning of the story and says that this is what this is about. I sense in you that rather than this being an issue of justice where you don't think you're getting what you deserve, you're just coveting more. You just want more for yourself. And we have to be very careful about that, especially when we find ourselves in those situations. But then notice how the parable, wrong slide there. Notice how the parable starts. Let me go to the right one there. In verse 16, and he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. Now, Jesus could have told all kinds of stories. He could have made this imaginary person any kind of person he wanted to. Could have been a businessman, could have been an entrepreneur, could have been any scenario that he wanted to. I find it interesting that Jesus chose basically a farmer, that the land of a rich man produced plentifully. Now, the irony is not lost on me. We're just wrapping up this series from the book of Genesis in which the land produced plentifully, and according to what God told them to do, Joseph basically built bigger barns. But of course, we know that he wasn't building those bigger barns for himself, but doing that so that he could be loving to his neighbors and provide for them. But notice what Jesus says, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. If you look, who is the hero, who or what is the hero of that opening sentence? It's the land. Notice that. What is very interesting is it does not say a man made well for himself. A farmer did an incredible job. Jesus starts the story by saying the land of a rich man produced plentifully. Now, for those of you who have been involved in farming, there's a lot of work that goes into farming, right? There's a whole lot of work to do in order to be successful in farming, but if you do all of that work and do it in a successful way, does that guarantee that you're going to be successful? No, because there is a humongous part of farming that is absolutely and utterly dependent upon God. And that's what Jesus tells in this story, that the wealth this man is experiencing is not something he was able to produce for himself. It was something that God gave him. I love what Peterson says here. The Creator is incredibly generous. I think that's just worth pausing for reflection right there. God is incredibly generous to us. We are given what we need, but much more, so much more. With all this wealth in and around us, who needs God? And of course, we know the right answer to that question. If you get the right answer to that question, who needs God? Everybody. Going back to Acts 17:28, in Him we live and move and have our being. Everybody needs God. But the point that Peterson is making is we have to be very careful amidst the abundance of our life that we don't forget our need for God. If you remember, I don't know if any of you have your notes from last week, but we talked about some of those parallel elements within the story. We talked about those stories began with relationship and how both of them, the prayer and the parable, both had bread in there. But the bread in particular pointed us to the attitude of need. We talked about how crucial it is that we maintain a posture of need in our life. And what Peterson is pointing us to, what Jesus is pointing us to in telling us this story, is that we're in danger sometimes with all of the wealth that is around us that we forget our need for God. Peterson says, poverty is the condition in which we discover our urgent need for God. Does that mean that we in America have no hope of discovering our urgent need for God? What kind of poverty can be included here? Spiritual poverty. That's what Jesus was referring to in the Sermon on the Mount in the Beatitudes when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He's talking about this spiritual poverty in which we recognize that we desperately need God. And Peterson says wealth is the opposite of this condition. We have far more than enough, and we lose our basic sense of neediness. And then he says, in our preoccupation with bigger barns, we forget about asking for bread for our friend. I love how Peterson ties those two parables together and reminds us kind of the overarching narrative of what Jesus is telling us about. And I think this is where the Joseph story really helps us because, like I said, Joseph built bigger barns, but it wasn't to make Pharaoh richer. It was to keep everybody alive. It was to sustain God's people. So we have to be very careful in the overabundance that God has blessed us with, that we don't forget it is all from His hand, and that we don't fail to ask ourselves, why has He given me this? Why did He give me a plentiful crop this year? Is it because there's somebody in need right around me? And instead of figuring out a way to raise my standard of living, is there something that God wants me to do with this? Is that the reason that He has given this to me? And I think when Jesus concludes with this verse, He's putting us on the right track here. So is the one the danger there. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. We're rich in a lot of ways. Of course, we know the story well. We know it better from Matthew's version about laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven rather than treasures on earth, and Jesus gives us the reason for that. In fact, he gives us two very good reasons that we should lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven and not on earth. He gives us a negative. What's the negative he gives us about treasures on earth? What does Jesus say negatively about those treasures on earth? Okay, you can't take it with you, and moth and rust destroy. It is vulnerable from the beginning. You can't protect it like you wish you could. So if you're going to choose to invest in earthly treasure, just know it could be gone in an instant. But then he also gives us a very positive reason to invest in treasures in heaven. Remember that the end of that story, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I like to conclude with that thought because many times we think about it the other way around, that wherever my heart is, whatever I love, those are the things I'm going to invest in. Those are the things I'm going to sacrifice for. Those are the things I'm going to pour my efforts into. But Jesus said it works the other way around. Wherever your treasure is, where do you spend your time? Where do you spend your money? Where do you spend your emotions? Wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so we have to recognize what the true treasure is. We have to recognize the generosity of God, the Creator and the Provider for us. And we got to ask ourselves in the midst of abundance, not where am I going to put all this, but what does God want me to do with all this? I think it's a great thing for us as a church to be asking as we prepare to dedicate that bigger barn. Not that it's something glorious for us, but why has God blessed us with a great facility and a great church family? Is it to make our Sundays and Wednesdays comfortable? Or is it to continue to share His love with everybody around us? So let's take that to heart.